She's back there in case I need her, but I haven't needed her yet. So,
Oh, okay.
so I am ready anytime you are ready for me to start.
We is ready.
Okay. What I'm going to talk about here are the third system defenses of New Orleans. The plan was that I would give this one on the first night of the conference, and then we go see these defenses. But now we're just going to talk about them. So I've got plenty of pictures, that kind of thing, and away we go. Is my full screen showing as my presentation, or
Yes,
is
it
my
is.
face up there too? Okay, my face is not showing.
No,
Your face is in a corner for me, but I think that's because I put it there and I can drag it off.
Okay, because I don't need my face to be up there at all. So, Carol, that's the one thing you could do for me is, okay, hide thumbnail video. I got it. Okay, super. All right. So there were three major routes going into the city of New Orleans. The first route and the primary one was going straight up the Mississippi River. That led you right up into the city of New Orleans right here. The secondary route was to come through the Lake Bourne area and then into Lake Pontchartrain. That didn't get you to the ports of the city, but it got you right off of the city where you can bombard the city with impunity. So that was considered a very important route also. And then the third route was coming up through Barataria Bay, way in the south, and up through a whole bunch of bayous to get you up to the Mississippi. There are several connectors that go over to the Mississippi. They're shallow water, so they'd be only good for landing troops or bringing troops in shallow barges, that kind of thing. But still was something they worried about, is getting warships into Barataria Bay and then being able to move troops up from there. And then there were also three secondary routes into the river above Fort St. Philip. Once you got past Fort St. Philip, there were no fortifications up here, and you could come through Bayou Bienvenue and Shell Beach, some of these areas in here. So you had the Bayou Bienvenue route coming in. This is the one that the British used during the War of 1812. The second route was from Shell Beach down here along. You can get through various bayous that lead through there. And then finally, you could go through what is now the Violet Canal. But it was, at that time, it was simply a bayou. It's been deepened into a deep water canal at this point in time. So those were secondary routes. They weren't, they were all shallow water routes, but they were ways to get to the Mississippi bypassing Fort St. Philip. So Bernard looked at all this and set his priorities in place. Fort St. Philip was already there, so we at least had some defense. It was fairly primitive, but we have some defense there of the Mississippi River. So he moved that down his priorities and said that the routes from Lake Bourne to Lake Pontchartrain were the ones that would most likely be used by an attacker. They were the ones he was most concerned about, and therefore he'd address those first. The area up through Barataria Bay, even though that was a shallow water area, he considered that to be the next most important one. And then we're always fighting the last war, and Ship Island is where the British gathered their troops when they launched their attack on New Orleans for the Battle of Chalmette. And we wanted to defend that island, kind of closing the barn door after the horse is out, but we didn't want somebody to be able to use that to attack once again. So that went down as last on the list of defenses that Bernard wanted to put in place. So he developed a plan. He designed one fort to be used in three different places. So three identical forts. One would be at the Rigalee, which is one of the passes between Lake Bourne and Lake Pontchartrain. The other at Fort Wood at past Chef Menteur, which is the other major pass that goes through there. Then, and you can recognize those if you're driving down Highway US 90. Those are the two major bridges across as you're coming into New Orleans. And then down in the very south, Fort Livingston was going to be a triplet to Forts Pike and Fort Wood. Then across from Fort St. Philip, since that's the Mississippi River route, and Fort St. Philip was an old fort that wasn't as well designed as the third system forts were. He decided to put a new fort in there, and that was Fort Jackson at Plaquemine Bend. The nice thing about Plaquemine Bend is that it was a very, very sharp curve, and a ship had to tack multiple times to get around that curve. So it would be under the guns of the fort for quite some time. And then finally, a new fort to guard Ship Island, which was Fort Massachusetts. The secondary routes into the Mississippi River above Fort St. Philip, Bayou Bienvenue, he put in Battery Bienvenue. A Martello tower was put in at the entrance to the Violet Canal, Tower du Pre, which is now gone. Hurricane Katrina took that down. And then a very large, powerful square tower, not a Martello, one of the big defensive towers, similar to the ones at Fort Porter at the Erie Canal in Buffalo, New York, and Fort Winthrop in Boston Harbor. One very similar to those at Proctor's Landing. And that's what now we call Shell Beach. So if we look at that from a map standpoint, we have Fort Pike and Fort Wood were designed right up here where I have the A and B here, guarding that passage to Lake Pontchartrain. We have the third of the triplets in the original design, Fort Livingston down here coming into Barataria Bay. Then coming up the Mississippi River at Plaquemine Bend, you can see that sharp curve here on the map in the Mississippi. That's where Fort Jackson was built. And then Fort Massachusetts up here on Ship Island. Interestingly enough, when I was at Fort Massachusetts, a cruise ship coming into New Orleans came close enough to Fort Massachusetts that I felt like standing on the ramparts, I could reach out and touch the side of a ship. So that channel coming into New Orleans is still used by cruise ships today, where Fort Massachusetts stands. Then the secondary defenses, we have Battery Bienvenue up here at Bayou Bienvenue, Tower du Pre out here. Now it's out in the water a ways. Only the foundation is left. As I had said, Katrina took down the tower. But that's out here in the water off the entrance to the Violet Canal. And then down here, Fort Proctor near Shell Beach. With Shell Beach, you can actually reach by road, and you can stand there at Shell Beach and see Proctor's Tower out here. Incidentally, Proctor's Tower is also referred to by the locals as Fort Beauregard, as Beauregard was the engineer who was building that when construction stopped. So if we look at these forts one by one, the first one we come to is Fort Pike. That was the first fort of the third system. Construction began at the same time on Fort Pike and Fort Monroe, but of course Fort Pike was much simpler and smaller than Fort Monroe, so that was done first. So that holds the record in 1819 as being the first fort built in the third system. It has a seacoast front of unprotected masonry, which is kind of typical of third system forts. It had just two tiers of guns, one casemated tier and one barbette tier. And it guarded the Rigolets, the pass between Lake Borgne and Lake Pontchartrain. It's still a very popular pass used by pleasure boats coming back and forth between those two lakes. Here's a picture of the Seacoast Casemates there, a nice curved front, very beautiful design. Nice to look at the brickwork in there. This had what was called tunnel casemates. This is the Seacoast area down here and the parade behind it. And to protect the rear of the guns from land-based cannon, Bernard designed this with these long tunnels that come through leading to the casemate. The problem with that is it didn't provide adequate ventilation. The other thing is Bernard made a basic mistake in here. Again, it was his first fort here. but a basic mistake in not putting in smoke vents. He had to come back later and cut smoke vents into the brickwork in these casemates. So apparently, the first time they did a practice firing of a cannon in those casemates, it got really miserably smoky. You'd think that with the barrel of the cannon out side the embrasure that you wouldn't get a lot of black powder smoke inside the embrasure, but as that cannon recoiled, the Bernoulli effect would have pulled a lot of that smoke into the casemate, and you really needed the ventilation in there. Interestingly enough, this is just a little aside here, is when the forts in New England, the very last ones of the third system were being built, the smoke vents were being put in different places in the casemates. Not all the forts were designed the same way. And that leads me to the conclusion that throughout the third system, they never did really solve the problem of the smoke inside the casemates. They were still experimenting with where they were going to put these smoke vents. So I don't think they ever fixed that over the entire period of 51 years of the third system. Here's another picture of one of the casemates taken from the tunnel. You can see where the narrow area is here, and then it widens out into the casemate itself. This also did not have a monkey run. So if you're running powder, you had to go around the gun carriage in each of the casemates. So several things were learned after building the first forts of the third system, where they improved as they went along. So here's a picture of the Barbette Tier. You can see along here. Excuse me. You can see where the Barbette guns were located up here. The interesting thing was the land defenses of these three New Orleans forts that were built down here: Fort Pike, Fort Wood, and Fort Jackson. And they all shared the concept of two wet ditches with outworks in between the wet ditches. So you can see a causeway coming across to the outworks. There was no drawbridge here, just a causeway, but it's still very narrow passageway. And then you had a demi-lune located at this point right here. You can see in my sketch here, which is simply a colorized version of a National Archives drawing of this. You can see the banquette right here, banquette slope, and then the terraplane down here behind that with masonry revetment for that. Went across, and this was a causeway that ended in a, excuse me, ended in a drawbridge right here at the fort itself, at the sally port of the fort. And then, of course, you had the masonry of the fort. If you look at this whole thing in plan, you can see the road coming through on the land, and that led to this causeway. Then you had a curved passageway that came through this demi-lune. You can see the curved demi-lune right here. Came through this demi-lune, and then that opened to the terraplane of the demi-lune, and then across the second causeway that ended in a drawbridge. And then here was the gorge of the fort. So you can see these designs. This outer moat went all the way around and joined to the Wrigley, and the inner moat then joined the outer moat out here on the Seacoast front. As I had mentioned before, that's unprotected masonry. And here's another picture. You can see very nicely the curvature here of the demi-lune. And then right here, I'll get to this in a minute, but you had a traverse right here and a crochet around that traverse leading to the fort itself. This is the remnants of the inner ditch, and the outer ditch out here is all filled in, but that would have been right about where this driveway is that comes around by the fort. And here you can see I'm pointing out the demi-lunes located here and another demi-lune on this curtain. The fort had two curtains. The geometric shape here is a sector, a piece of pie essentially, with two demi-bastions and a full bastion at the salient of that. The Citadel followed the Seacoast fort around with a 8-sided structure right here. Okay, here you can see the detail of the crochet that comes around the traverse. So the traverse prevented an attacker who had overrun the outworks over here on the side from coming into the demi-lune. Or I guess conversely, if they had overrun the demi-lune, they couldn't get back through here. And the crochet allowed troops to go back and forth from the demi-lune to the outworks, but only one person wide. So that's very, very easy to defend. So the crochet is the French word for a curved hook, or a little hook. And this formed that hook that we're talking about right here. By the way, it is the same word that's used in knitting. When somebody crochets a sweater, that means they use a little hook to do that. So you can see the outward. Now, what I did here is I colorized this area a brighter green. This would have been up even with the height of the ramparts here. So even though now that's all been demolished and you no longer have the traverse there, that traverse would have been quite high and masonry revetted. You can still see some of the masonry at that point. So here's the main work. As I had said, it's a sector with 2 demi-bastions and a full bastion. If you look through the embrasures of the full bastion and the demi-bastions, you can see they protect the curtain along here. And as always in the third system fort, the face of the bastion, if you trace this line out, it intersects right here at the throat of the bastion itself. So there's no place along this wall that you could hide from fire from this embrasure. And conversely, the wall on the left side of this picture, the embrasure that we're looking at over on the other side, would control that surface. When I'm talking about bastion faces, I always talk about Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, nowhere to run to, nowhere to hide. Inside the fort was the Citadel. The original Citadel came to this point. You can see the change in the color of the bricks. Just came up to that point. It had 2 levels of loopholes in it, and the upper level of loopholes could be reached from the bunks that were in there. In Fort Wood, which we'll talk about in a minute, inside the barracks, you can actually see, if you look very closely, the outline of the wooden bunks against the wall. So it shows you how those bunks would have supported the upper tier of embrasures. Later, after the third system, when this fort was being reused, they actually built a single brick wide wall along the top and actually created another level of barracks area up above that was supposed to catch the wind better. And it actually did catch the wind very nicely of some subsequent hurricanes that came through, and they knocked that whole top level off. The construction up here wasn't anywhere near as substantial as the construction of the Citadel itself. So now we switch over to Fort Wood. It was named for Eleazar Wood. Also, there was another Fort Wood in the system that was used as the base of the Statue of Liberty. It was a second system fort on Bedloe's Island, now called Liberty Island. But that Fort Wood and this Fort Wood were both named for the same guy, Eleazar Wood. And that became confusing to have 2 active forts with the same name, both coastal forts. So they changed this to Fort Macomb in honor of Alexander Macomb, who was chief engineer at that time. This picture shows the marina that's in place there. Katrina, the one good thing that Katrina did is it knocked this whole marina down. The boats coming in and out were badly undercutting the walls of Fort Macomb. And it's really a good thing that that marina is no longer in use. The second good thing that Katrina did is when it knocked down the bridge at Fort Pike, they used the rubble from the bridge to create a seawall around Fort Pike, which preserves that from any wave action from the Pass Regalie. So Fort Macomb guards Chef Menteur. As I had said, it was originally designed as a triplet, but they were able to reduce the construction was able to reduce the casemate size and therefore make the fort a little bit smaller, which saved money, saved area, that kind of thing, by still maintaining the same number of casemates and the same angle of fire, angle of traverse of the cannon in the fort. So that was a good thing. The interesting thing is, if you go to the National Archives and look at the drawings, it looks like it's identical to, they're not as-built drawings, they're design drawings. So it's identical to Fort Pike. But when you walk into the fort, you realize that the parade is smaller in Fort Macomb than it is in Fort Pike. And after doing some measurements, running back and forth between the two forts with a tape measure, I came up with the knowledge that the casemates are actually smaller, and that's how that whole thing became a smaller fort. Since Fort Livingston was not built with the same plan at all, Totten had taken over by then and used a totally different plan. We'll never know whether that would have been an actual twin to Fort Macomb, but Fort Pike and Fort Macomb are now near twins, not actual twins, not identical twins, I should say. The entry passageway from Fort Wood or Fort Macomb, whichever you wish to call it, is intact, and it's now buried in a whole bunch of woods and this kind of thing. I was hoping the last time I was there to get over there. It's going to take some real chopping through the jungle area there to see if we can still see this, but this is original and had nice smooth curved walls. When the Park Service rebuilt the entry passageway at Fort Pike, they made sharp angles in there rather than these beautiful curved walls. I'm sure it's just because it was too difficult to do that kind of brickwork. The masons that built these forts were just really, really talented. So at any rate, this one, if we get to see this when we do the conference in New Orleans, if and when we do the conference in New Orleans, then hopefully we'll be able to see the brickwork here. It really is very, very nice. And you can see here the curve of the demi-lune, the same as Fort Pike. You can see here that the Citadel is much closer to the walls of the fort. The Citadel is identical in size to the Citadel at Fort Pike. And that was the first clue that these were different. And I started doing the measurements to discover what I had just talked about. So now if we go to the Mississippi River forts, Fort St. Philip was located in a very nice spot where it could fire down the river, and a really good location over here on the right bank of the Mississippi. And the new fort, Fort Jackson, was built down here across so it could cooperate with it. During the Civil War, a chain was put across here. The Confederates put a chain across as well and put a small battery on the other side to cooperate with Fort Jackson here, as well as putting guns in Fort St. Philip to cooperate. So as you can see by this turn, you had a lot of tacking for sailboats and spent time under the guns of the fort. So Fort St. Philip was a colonial fort, flew a couple of different flags over it before the US government took it over. All the guns were mounted in Barbette. And unfortunately, there's silt that fills the fort up to the ramparts of almost to the ramparts of the fort. And it's interesting when you look at the chapel in there, since it was a French fort, they always had a chapel inside. When you look at the chapel, all you see is a small arch on the entranceway to the chapel. The fill has filled the whole chapel up so that it's only a little bit of area that you can get through. And then downstream of the colonial fort, over here is where the Endicott batteries were placed. So here's a picture of Fort St. Philip during the Civil War. This is either during or right after the Civil War. You can tell by the large cannon that are up here on steel mounts. So this is after the Union had taken over the fort, or fairly long afterward. And then you can see the fort here. You see this tall wall right here. That's this one, and you can see where the silt has filled that up. And that's actually a postern heading outside the fort, but you can see that the silt has filled that, and you can't really use that postern at all anymore unless you want to try to crawl through it. And with the number of snakes in this area, you probably don't want to crawl through it. So then we come down to Fort Jackson, which is the actual third system fort in this area. And there's a little tidal area right here that's usually flooded, and then just a small earthen mound that goes around on the seacoast side of that, or the riverine side of that. And you can see we have sets of casemates there. This is one of those pentagonal forts that has only two sets of casemates on it to the seaward side. The other one like that is Fort Independence in Boston Harbor. That has casemates only facing the harbor, where this one has casemates only facing the Mississippi. It has two wet ditches, as Fort Pike did. Outworks located between the ditches. There's a lot left in the outworks there. A really nice little fort. So I've got some section drawings here. Again, these are taken from National Archives, and I colorized them and put some labels on them. But you can see you have your outer ditch out here, a long glacis leading up to the parapet. You have a banquette and covered way here, then the inner ditch on this side, and this is the riverine front. You can see the tidal berm right here and the shallow area there. That just keeps any ships, even shallow draft ships, from getting into the inner ditch. Then you have the inner ditch here and the main work itself. So if you look at this, you have the two casemated fronts right here that face the river. You have bastions all around here, one gorge wall here, and this one had a 10-sided citadel on the inside. This was all beautiful woodwork. It was open to the sky. There's a book on Civil War forts that's really poorly done. Tries to do a look at the third system, but there's a drawing in there that shows this as a covered structure. It never was. This was all an open air veranda type area in this courtyard in the center. And then the barracks area was all around the outside. This again had loopholes rather than any kind of windows in here. And this became a major problem due to the southern climates. You can imagine being in an area that was only ventilated by loopholes during a Louisiana summer with the humidity and the insects and all that kind of thing. So this fort, like most of them, they built some wooden barracks either up on the ramparts or outside the fort itself. One of the interesting things about this fort, it's the only fort in the third system that has cavaliers. And the cavalier is the wall comes around as if the bastion did not exist, and have rifle firing positions all along this point. And the bastion is at a lower elevation than the ramparts of the fort. So the ramparts of the bastion are controlled completely by this cavalier. So if an enemy would come in and manage to take the bastion, they'd still be under fire from the cavalier. So a very interesting defense. Here's a look at Fort Jackson. This is the casemated Seacoast front, and you had bastions with flank howitzers on each side here. You can see the casemates along here. And this mound of dirt that you see right here is part of an Endicott battery that was added inside the fort later. But here's the original casemates of the fort on the riverine sides. So the entry passageway was similar to what we had at Fort Pike, but a few little idiosyncrasies that were different. So this is outside the fort. An enemy would have to cross this long causeway, being under fire from this ravelin right here, passageway through the outworks of the ravelin. You had the terraplane of the ravelin here, and then another causeway that ended in a drawbridge right here. And this is the main fort itself, in the parade of the fort back here. So here's a look at it. This is the inner ditch. No longer a drawbridge here, but right here is where the drawbridge was. Incidentally, the drawbridge mechanism is still pretty much intact up here, and very interesting to look at how that whole mechanism worked. You had a couple of howitzer embrasures here guarding this entranceway into the fort, as well as barbette guns up here. Unfortunately, you can see a lot of trees that are growing on the ramparts of the fort. That's something that there's a constant battle on whether or not they can take these trees down. It's a county park, and people like the shade, especially in the hot Louisiana summers. So the non-historians want the trees to stay, and those of us who are worried about the fort itself want them gone so the roots don't destroy the brickwork. So this was modified in 1858 by Beauregard. Incidentally, he was down there with the Confederacy trying to fight against all the things he did to improve the fort. But it added a great deal of firepower along the Mississippi with just an open barbette battery, but it could house large cannon along this barbette battery, up to 15-inch Rodman guns. So this was a very important addition to the fort. And you can see here's the fort itself, and then here's this this addition to the fort that Beauregard put in 1858. Then later, during the 1870s, this was modified. And what you see there today is the 1870s outworks along here that were put on top of Beauregard's water battery here. And that used the standard thing of 2 Rodman guns, a traverse magazine, 2 more Rodman guns, a traverse magazine, 2 more Rodman guns, and so forth, heading out in this direction. Now, one of the things that I find very interesting and very important about Fort Jackson is the run past that DuPont and Farragut did in able to get the ships back past the fort was written up in great detail by J.G. Barnard after the Civil War. And he did a treatise and talked about the fact that it takes 15-inch Rodman guns or larger to stop ironclads from running past the fort. That the older 42-pounders, that kind of thing, would not do the job. So at Fort Jackson, you see a fort where Farragut successfully ran past the fort, and then the implementation of the modifications to prevent that from ever happening again at the same site. So for a historian, it's a very important thing to see. And then just to show you what happened during the Endicott period, this was left in place. This is the 1870s battery over here. And a disappearing gun battery was put in place here, and a rapid fire AMTB battery was put in over here. Now we go down to the mouth of Barataria Bay, opposite Grand Isle. You can only get to it by boat, but Grand Terre Island, which Grand Terre is where Jean Lafitte had his fortress home located there. But Totten decided that he didn't like the designs of Fort Pike and Fort Wood, so he designed his own fort, similar in some ways, though different in size, quite a bit different in size, to Fort Barrancas. Fort Livingston is much larger than Fort Barrancas. But he has 2 counterscarp galleries and howitzer emplacements in each end of these 2 long counterscarp galleries that would protect the other 2 faces of the fort. And then counterscarp galleries with for rifle fire, and then more howitzer embrasures down here at the salient of these outworks. And then basically a kite-shaped fort, and trapezoid here with a large earthen area for barbette type cannon mounts, and then casemates around these sides. The difference here is the casemates open up to loopholes, not to cannon embrasures. So the heavy cannon would be mounted along these areas, and this would simply be for land defense. And then the casemates here don't even reach the outer part of the fort. So there's no openings in the wall along these sides. So all the major cannon were mounted in barbette. The place d'armes that takes up about 1/3 of the fort is now gone. That's what was washed away by tidal action in the hurricanes. So the fort is often underwater. I've been there multiple times, and Once in a while, I've been lucky enough to get there when there's not water in there, but there is a lot of water to fight in there, and a lot of water snakes like to live in here, some of them with a fairly mean variety. And this area right here seems to be an incredible breeding ground for mosquitoes. So the fort is very well protected these days by snakes and mosquitoes, even though it only has 2 walls left. This shows where the tidal action has knocked down portions of the fort. And you can see this is the big Place d'Armes, and that's been all washed away. The water laps right up against the wall of the fort, though they have put some breakwaters in this area to protect it. So it's more protected now than it was, but still only a portion of the fort is left, but it is well worth visiting. Very, very interesting. Here's another look at it. You can see this is where the storms knocked down the walls of the fort here, and this is where the big Place d'Armes was. This is looking up. Here's the counterscarp gallery along here, and the fort itself. B.W. Smith and I actually were brave enough to crawl into this counterscarp gallery, and we went down there quite a ways. It's quite interesting. It's a typical counterscarp gallery, but it was nice to get in there. And on the other side of the fort, the counterscarp gallery has been flooded. It's interesting where you see the break here in the granite coping. That's actually where the drawbridge came down at a very steep angle leading down into the sally port of the fort. So a very interesting design that I haven't seen repeated any place. The closest thing is the relatively steep angle of the drawbridge at Fort Barrancas, but even that is not nearly as steep as this drawbridge would have been at Fort Livingston. So then we move over to Ship Island on the channel coming in. This is Fort Massachusetts. It was never officially named Fort Massachusetts. It was always the fort on Ship Island. But when the Massachusetts ran aground, they took all of the guns from the Massachusetts and moved them into the fort. And the garrison called the fort then the unnamed fort, Fort Massachusetts, and it stuck. And the historic site now goes by the name Fort Massachusetts today. So it's on what is now West Ship Island. First time I visited Fort Massachusetts, it was simply Ship Island before a hurricane came through and cut the island in half. And it certainly was that when the fort was built. I'm not that old. So it was one island back in those days. And it is a major deep water anchorage. And people say, why in the world this little island with no importance? Was it just pork belly politics that caused Mississippi to have a third system fort? But it really was a good anchorage, and those were very valuable for a fleet to be able to ride out storms, that kind of thing. And with all the storms we had this year, you realize how important that could be. And it is on that main channel of New Orleans, as I mentioned with the cruise ship. It is by far the smallest fort of the third system. And you can see this would fit in one of the bastions of Fort Monroe very easily. But when you compare it to some of the other forts of a third system, even Fort Wood, which is one of the smallest of the system, is larger than Fort Massachusetts. It's a tiny little fort, but a really, really interesting little fort. Kind of looks like a happy face here, or maybe a frog, something like that. Really, when you look at it in plan, it's really pretty funny looking. But you had 2 4-pintle gun mounts pointed out toward the gorge of the fort, and then 2 360-degree center pintle mounts for 15-inch Rodman guns. And there is one of those 15-inch Rodman guns still in place there. And then 4-pintle mounts all the way along the seacoast front of the fort. And below this would be the casemates that had these. This area you can see is very thick, so there were a lot of quarters and those kind of functions inside this area that was very well protected by an earthen top. So when you look at it from the outside, you can see the curved face of the seacoast front here, and then 2 demi-bastions protecting the gorge wall on the back. So it's a circular fort that's just cut off in the gorge wall, by the gorge wall, and demi-bastions overhanging that. So looking down into the small parade, you can see this is a lot of the big earthen protected area here, and your casemates coming along the outside of the fort. The stair towers were freestanding here, and then a set of stairs that span the gap between this freestanding stair tower and the ramparts of the fort. Very rare design. You had something similar at Fort Gorges in Maine, but very interesting the way they did that. You can see the shot furnace in here too, used with hot shot. If you look at the color of the bricks on the walls of the fort, you realize that this was built in 3 different sections. First by the Corps of Engineers, then by the Confederates, and then again finished by the Corps of Engineers after the Civil War, or late in the Civil War, after the fort was taken. Well, it wasn't taken by battle, but after the Confederates abandoned the fort and the Union forces took it over. Now we move to the structures that were less than a fort. We have Battery Bienvenue, which is where Bayou Vierre meets Bayou Bienvenue. That's the route that the British used when they came in to attack New Orleans and were met at Chalmette by Jackson. Incidentally, the hotel I'm staying in was used by Andrew Jackson as his headquarters in Mobile. But it's a closed back fort, but it doesn't have casemates. So it was called in all the engineering drawings a battery, but technically a battery is open back and a fort is closed back. So is this a fort or a battery? I guess the answer is yes. It's one or the other. The engineers, as I've said over the years, call things exactly what they darn well please, not necessarily what Mahan taught them to call it at West Point. So there are 4 cannon that are still on site, and you can't see them in this picture, but there are 4 spots where there's a cannon mounted. I believe it's 2 32-pounders and 2 42-pounders, if I remember correctly. There was a barracks building along the back. There were officers' quarters. I believe this was the officers' quarters over here. A guardhouse back here, a magazine over here. That magazine's reasonably well intact. And then you had your scarp wall coming around the outside of the fort. Much thicker here, and all the cannon were mounted there. You've got some good solid ground here, and then it drops down to a real swampy area that's hard to walk in back here. And again, this is well guarded by snakes. So here's some of the remnants of the structures that are left here. Here's the magazine that's in reasonably good shape, and some of the foundation and bottom structures of the officers' quarters. Same thing here. Then we go to Tower du Pre. Unfortunately, it is gone. It was built on 4 levels. Unlike a typical Martello tower, it had its entrance on the first level rather than the second. First level was designed with loopholes around the outside and embrasures on the upper 2 levels. And again, a Martello tower would have been open topped with a gun up here. But this was not designed that way. It had a top on it. This upper level was damaged badly in a hurricane and cut off, and a new roof put on such that it looked like this, and it was used as a fish camp for quite a few years. And that's the condition it existed in up until Katrina, when Katrina took it down. Now, all you can see is this lower part right here, and the foundations and some of the interior walls of the tower. Proctor's Tower, also referred to as Fort Beauregard at times, was superintended by Beauregard. It used iron beams as structural components in the fort for the first time. So interesting to see the iron beams in there and all that kind of thing. There was something on a website that talked about how the state of Louisiana had gone in to shore up the fort using steel beams. And that was not the case at all. These were original iron beams that are in the fort. If you look at it from the air, you can see it was never finished. That's not battle damage or anything like that. It's just they stopped after the first level of construction. But it did have a seawall going all the way around the outside that protected the fort from tidal action, but also, like Fort Jefferson, that seawall prevented a ship from coming in and discharging Marines into the fort itself from the masts of the ship. There's another good look at the tower, what it looks like today. Really nice little tower. You can see all the loopholes here. And the second tier where it was started, but not completed. So we had 5 forts and 3 other structures I refer to as appurtenant structures that guarded all these various approaches that a ship could take to get in. Only one was attacked, that was Fort Jackson on the Mississippi. Now, Fort St. Philip was attacked also at the same time,